So a question that I get often asked is, what's a good carpeting plant? Well, in today's video, I'm going to showcase 5 of my favorite carpeting plants that we currently sell. So stay tuned to check that out. What's going on, guys? Justin from HTOplants.com here today, and we are going to be talking about carpeting plants. Now, I get this question every week almost on what's a good carpeting plant for my tank, and my answer is usually about the same. Now, your carpeting plant choices are going to vary from your tank size to the type of fish you have to if you have a light or what kind of light you have, and if you have CO2. The substrate will kind of matter, but as long as you don't have like really big gravel or really fine sand, most of these should be able to grow in it without a problem. So if you have a coarse sand or you have like aqua soil or Eco Complete or fluorite, anything like that, these should virtually work in that. But let's touch on a few of them. Now, in no particular order, we're going to first talk about dwarf four-leaf clover. Now, I've already done a sole video on this plant by itself. It is my favorite carpeting plant out of all of them. This one is, it's like choosing your favorite child. This one is by far my favorite when it comes to carpeting plants. It just works so well. Sometimes I've had a couple people say that they had issues with it, but relatively it grows in like any conditions. As long as it's not buried in really fine sand, it should do really well. It doesn't need a whole lot of light. It doesn't need CO2. I had this growing in a tank where it was completely covered with floating plants, where literally there was barely any light getting down to the plants, and it was still able to grow, and the CO2 wasn't even working on the tank. So if you want a super easy carpeting plant, four-leaf clover, dwarf four-leaf clover, especially because it's a smaller variety, so it's meant for smaller tanks. So next up, we're going to talk about Monte Carlo. This is number 2, and Monte Carlo is kind of a mixed bag for me. It works in some tanks and it doesn't work in others, but for the most part, I have more success with it than I have failures. So overall, I really enjoy this carpeting plant, and also like a lot of people tell me that they have really good success with this plant in virtually no CO2 or low light conditions. So I'm gonna say roughly around middle light area and maybe CO2 this would grow ideally in. I haven't tested it with super low light and no CO2 yet, but I will say that it does grow incredibly fast. So as long as it gets enough light, it should be fine without CO2. So I'm using it in several different tanks, my 55 gallon, my 60P I think it is, and also this tank next to me here as a foreground plant. And it's very versatile. You could use it on rocks and driftwood and stuff like that. It will latch on. You do have to kind of coax it a little bit by either like wrapping a string around it or something, but it will root onto things. It rooted on dragonstone, and it works out pretty good. So number 3 on my list is going to be Microsword. Now, I've had a bit of issues with this plant in the past, but it's been a narrow leaf variation, and I haven't tried it again since the very early days of me keeping planted tanks, except until more recently. I'm going to actually show you a sneak peek of a tank that is going to be debuted in a future video here on the channel. But the Microsword is actually growing really well under the Asta lights that I have on top of these tanks, and it has no CO2 in the current tank that it's running. So it's doing really well, and I was actually impressed by it. So I would rank it, as a pretty easy carpeting plant in that manner. The fact that it's just growing without CO2 and barely any light, it's doing rather well for me. So number 4 is a very popular one, and that's Dwarf Sedge. Now, Dwarf Sedge is kind of a mixed bag because it could get really tall depending on the lighting conditions. If you have a really powerful light, it will typically stay shorter, but if you don't have a whole lot of light, it will get a bit taller. So it may be better for middle of the ground tank, say between like a 40 and like a 75 gallon. Would be ideal. The other ones that I've already mentioned would be more ideal for smaller tanks, probably smaller than 40 gallons and smaller, but you could use it in 55s and 75s depending on the scape. Now, Dwarf Sedge, it grows by producing runners, and it'll basically produce a little kind of leg, and then it'll produce another baby plant from there, and then continue on. And that's how it reproduces. The other plants that I mentioned so far have a horizontal rhizome, or Monte Carlo has a stem, so you could actually just trim it and replant it. But Dwarf Sedge is a rosette type plant, where that means that all the plants come out from a center location, and it has roots from that center location, so then it sends out runners to produce new babies, offsprings. It's a pretty easy plant. Like I said, it depends on the type of light you have, and it doesn't really need CO2. It should be fine, but it does take a little bit to get established. It's probably one of the slower growers out of all these, but once it gets going, it gets going fast. That's the thing. It needs to establish first, and then really just put off those runners, which it'll do. And lastly, the probably more overlooked carpeting plant is using moss. Now, you could use really any kind of moss. My preference happens to be Christmas moss or mini Christmas moss or weeping moss. You could use flame moss too if you wanted to, depending on the scape. My preference is mini Christmas moss. So I'm actually going to show you in this tank here where we're using mini Christmas moss right now as a carpet-like effect. And you could do this with, you know, really any moss and kind of either sprinkle it out or tie it to stuff and allow it to carpet out on its own. Now, of course, this is going to take at a very long time. Moss grows at a super slow rate. So if you don't mind having really slow growing plants, you could just let this kind of go out and do its thing, and it'll eventually fill in an area. It may take some time, but honestly, I prefer slower growing plants. They're much easier to maintain. And that's the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. As always, make sure you leave a like and leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of any of the carpeting plants, which one's your favorite, which ones have you had experience with, and which one's the best one that you think should be up there. If you're new here and you really like aquarium content, make sure you hit that subscribe button right there. If you want to watch our last video, which was us doing this tank setup with moss balls as actually a foreground and carpeting plant as well, you can click that link there. And if you want to check out our video on setting up this other tank here, you could click that video right there. And I will see you guys on the next one.